In this chapter, we are going to be discussing the importance of nonverbal communication. We're going to start by looking at some of the principles and functions of nonverbal communication, then by talking about the many and various types of nonverbal communication, before finally talking about how we can become more competent in our nonverbal communication. So first, let's talk about some of those principles and functions of nonverbal communication by, of course, starting with a definition of what nonverbal communication is. Nonverbal communication is the process of generating meaning using behavior other than words. So if we look at this by comparing verbal and nonverbal communication with one another, verbal communication consists of the words that are said, whereas nonverbal communication is everything else. And these verbal and nonverbal aspects operate side by side with one another as part of the same system and are often intertwined with one another. An interesting thing about nonverbal communication is that there are no guides or rules that govern our use of nonverbal signals the same way that there were for verbal communication. In other words, you can't look up a gesture or a facial expression in the dictionary and come to understand what that gesture or facial expression means. There are no dictionaries, there are no thesauruses when it comes to nonverbal communication. And nonverbal comm can be taken in by all of our five senses, but we rely mostly on visual, auditory, and touch for the most part, right? Those are the things that we tend to focus on when it comes to our nonverbal communication. And as I was kind of saying earlier, there's an important distinction that needs to be drawn between vocal communication and verbal communication. And these two things play off of one another in really interesting ways and create all of these different kinds of communication that we use on a regular basis. And so I've created this little chart to kind of help you to better understand how both verbal and nonverbal communication include both vocal and non-vocal elements. So on the x-axis, going across the rows here, we have verbal and nonverbal communication. And then on the y-axis, in that first column, we have vocal and non-vocal communication. So at the intersection of verbal and vocal communication, we have the spoken word. So these are the actual words that are said in order to create a message, right? Verbal communication are the words that are said, and they are said using the voice, right? That's the vocal element of it. If, however, we look at verbal communication that is non-vocal, we are looking at things like writing and ASL, right? We are still communicating using words, but with writing, for example, we are putting the words down on paper rather than vocalizing them. And with American Sign Language, or ASL, we are communicating words, but we are doing so through specific gestures rather than through our voices. And so that's what we mean when we say that communication can be verbal and non-vocal. Communication can be also non-verbal and vocal. And this means that it's not the words that are said, but it's how they are said instead. And this is called paralanguage. So paralanguage has to do with the voice and the way that a message is said. So this has to do with the rate at which a message is sent, the volume, the pitch, the enthusiasm in the voice, all of that kind of stuff impacts the way that a message is received. It's nonverbal, right? So it has nothing to do with the words, but it is vocal. It's still voiced. And then finally, we have nonverbal communication that is also non-vocal. And this is body language, right? So we're not using words to communicate, we're not using our voices, but we're using gestures and eye contact and all of those sorts of things in order to get a message across. So as you can see, communication can be verbal and nonverbal, but it can also be vocal and non-vocal. And we use all of these different means of communicating, sometimes simultaneously, in order to get our message across. But you can see how important nonverbal communication is overall to the message that we are trying to send.